Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. We are on a high Afghan mountain road at night, and you and I are driving through thick fog. The headlights carve out a small tunnel of visibility. Inside that tunnel, we can see the center line of the road, the edge stones, the curve signs, the way the road slopes and bends. Outside the tunnel, the world is still there, but we are not allowed to talk about what we cannot see. Not because it isn't real, but because this is a discipline of honesty. Now, watch what happens as the road curves. There is one kind of information you can get instantly: the direction the road is pointing right now. That is the first derivative level. That is A, the first change of the lifted phase phi tilde. It tells you how the phase is changing when you move a little in any direction. But when the road begins to bend, direction is not enough. You can be pointing northeast right now, and yet the road can still be turning harder and harder to the right. The direction, at this moment, does not tell you how the direction itself is changing. That second layer, the change of change, is the difference between gliding safely through the curve and being surprised by it. It is the difference between steering for where the road is and steering for where the road is becoming. That is where we are now. Part 12 sealed the triunity. Omega, kappa, nu are not separate fields beside phi. They are readouts of one single stem, A equals d phi tilde. Time, space, and motion are not primitives. They are three inseparable projections of one derivative object, and they must always recombine back into A. No recomposition, no triunity claim. That was the oath. Now part 13 takes the next step in the alphabet. We do not add forces. We do not add laws. We do not add dynamics. We do not add what happened. That is later. Here, we are still inside the pure language. We are still freezing what can be said without cheating. And what can be said next is breathtakingly simple. If A is how phase changes, then the second jet layer is how that change itself changes. Not as an imported story about pushes and pulls, but as a constraint inside the finite jet stack. This is the second jet layer. This is the point where words like bending, curving, acceleration-like, dispersion-like, and interaction-like become possible. Only as jet relations, never as new primitive substances. Let me make that feel real. Imagine you are holding a strip of paper in your hands. If it lies flat, it feels simple. If it is tilted, it has a direction. That is like the first derivative. But if you curl it into an arc, now something new appears: curvature. Curvature is not a new material. You didn't pour curvature fluid onto the paper. Curvature is simply how the direction of the surface changes as you move across it. Or imagine a melody sung on one note. First you hear pitch. Then you hear pitch rising. That is the first change. But then you hear the rise itself bending, rising faster, slowing down, becoming vibrato, becoming a turn. That is the second change. You did not add a new singer. You listen deeper to the same voice. This is what the second jet layer is, listening deeper to the same stem. Now let's place it precisely inside our language. We have phi, a mapping from the minimal support x to the circle S1. We have local lift phi tilde, an unwrapping of phi on a lift valid patch P, mapping from P to the reline R, such that when you wrap phi tilde back to the circle, you recover phi on that patch. We have A defined as A equals d phi tilde. And we have jets. J and phi at a point x is the package of derivatives of phi tilde up to order n, where the domain is smooth enough to speak to that depth. So the second jet is J2 phi. It is the package up to second derivatives. In simple words, J2 phi contains the value of phi tilde at the point, the first derivative information A at the point, and the second derivative information, how A changes around that point. But we must say something sharply, because this is where physics has historically cheated. In ordinary stories, people jump from first derivatives to forces as if forces are things that exist independently, pushing the world around. Holophase refuses that move at language level. At language level, interaction-like structure is not introduced as a new primitive force. It is a pattern inside the second derivatives, constraints on how the first derivative field is allowed to vary. Later, when dynamics arrives, we will choose which constraints are actually enforced in a particular universe. But here, we are only freezing the grammar that makes such claims meaningful at all. So part 13 is the installation of the second jet layer as an alphabet layer, the place where change of change lives. Now keep the triunity alive while we do this, because the most tempting mistake at second order is to split the towers, to say, this is the temporal second derivative, or this is spatial curvature, or this is acceleration, as if each lives in its own silo. Holophase forbids that. Triunity means every derivative object echoes in three inseparable readouts. So the second jet layer encodes simultaneously how cadence changes, how texture bends, how transport deforms, and also the mixed derivatives, the cos couplings that appear when your chosen reading frame mixes directions. If someone makes a second jet claim that treats one readout tower as isolated, the language rejects it. That is not because the world cannot appear separable in certain approximations. It is because separability must be derived, not assumed. It must be a property of the constraint, not a premise of the language. Now let's bring in the four gates, living not as a list, but as the way we keep ourselves honest. First, the well-formedness gate for part 13. A statement about interaction-like structure must be expressible as an invariant or a constraint of J2 phi. That means, if you say something like, there is an influence here, you do not get to smuggle in a new object called force. You must present it as a constraint on the second derivatives of phi tilde, or equivalently on how A varies. You must show in the language what combination of second jet information you are referring to. If you cannot write it as a relation or constraint built from J2 phi, then at language level, it is not a sentence. It is an emotion. It is a metaphor. It may be inspiring, but it is not part of the grammar. This gate is strict for a reason. Without it, physics becomes a warehouse of invented primitives. Second, the invariance gate. Second jet statements must be invariant under our allowed redescriptions. Gate shifts of phi, lift sheet changes, chart changes on overlaps. This is where transformation grammar becomes essential, because second derivatives transform in more complicated ways than first derivatives. If you change coordinates, second derivatives do not just rotate. They pick up terms from the chain rule and the curvature of the coordinate transformation itself. So an honest second jet statement must be built from combinations that are chart invariant and lift class invariant. If your acceleration-like object changes just because you reparameterize the patch, then what you had was not structure. It was coordinate spelling. This gate is the difference between a genuine geometric bend and a bend created by a distorted map. Third, the domain gate. Second derivatives require domains typed at least C2. This sounds technical, but it is simple. You cannot talk about how change changes in a region where change itself is not smoothly defined. If the patch is only C1, you can speak A, but you cannot speak its variation as a smooth object. If the patch is C0, you cannot speak derivatives at all. So a second jet sentence must declare a domain where second derivatives exist. If someone refuses to specify that, the language rejects the sentence. This is how we prevent fake infinities and fake singularities. We do not pretend our calculus extends beyond its license. And fourth, the non-encodability challenge. If someone tries to add a force primitive, something beside phi and its jets, they must prove it cannot be encoded as a constraint on J2 phi. This is the sharpest firewall we have against primitive inflation. Historically, when physics met a phenomenon it could not explain, it invented a new force. But often, what was needed was not a new substance, but a deeper constraint on the existing structure. Holophase does not ban new structure. It bans unearned primitives. So the challenge is, show non-encodability. Show that no combination of second-jet constraints can express what you call force. If you cannot, then the force is not a primitive. It is a derived pattern in the second-jet layer. Now, to make the second-jet layer feel like a living alphabet, we need to see what kinds of patterns it can express, without turning them into dynamics. Here are the kinds of things that live naturally at second order. Bending, when direction changes as you move. Curving, when the field lines of A converge or diverge in a structured way. Acceleration-like behavior, when the cadence readout changes along an evolution direction. Dispersion-like behavior, when different scales or directions of variation spread out, even if the first derivative looked uniform. But remember, we are not naming these as forces or laws. We are only acknowledging that the second-jet alphabet can encode them as patterns. Let's make this concrete with a few images across scales. First, the river. Stand by a river and watch a leaf floating downstream. In one place, the river is straight and calm. The leaf moves with steady direction and steady speed. That is like first-jet information, a flow direction. But then the river narrows. The current accelerates. The leaf's motion changes. Or the river curves. The leaf's direction changes. Or the river has a whirl. The leaf circles. You can describe all of this without ever invoking a mystical force. You can describe it as the pattern of the flow changing from point to point. That is second-jet structure, how the first derivative field varies. The leaf does not need a new entity to explain why it curves. It needs a curvature of the flow field around it. Second, the human body. Put your hand on your chest. You feel a heartbeat. That's cadence. Now climb stairs. The cadence changes. That change of cadence is second order. It's not a new heart. It's the same heart responding to a changed condition. Or think of learning a skill, writing, playing an instrument, speaking a language. The first time you try, your performance changes awkwardly. With practice, the pattern of change changes. You don't just get better, you get better at getting better. That is a second derivative of skill acquisition. Again, not a new substance, but a higher order pattern. Third, the sky. Watch a flock of birds. At first you see motion, then you see the motion changing, tightening into a turn, spreading into a fan, compressing into a sudden shift. The shape of motion changing is a second-jet phenomenon. No extra primitive is needed. The group's velocity field varies. Its variation has structure, the flock bends. Fourth, the microscopic world. Think of a wave pattern in a pond. At first you see wave crests moving. That's first-order change. But then you see the wave packet spreading out, dispersion. That spreading is not an added force in the water. It is the second-order structure of how the phase gradient varies with position and direction. Again, second jet. Now bring triunity back into the center. At first derivative level, we had A as one stem with three readouts: cadence, texture, transport. In part 12, we insisted they are inseparable and must recombine. At second order, that inseparability deepens, because second derivatives include how each readout changes and how they mix, how cadence changes, an acceleration like shadow, how texture bends, a curvature like shadow, how transport deforms, a kinematic deformation like shadow, and mixed derivatives, how cadence changes across texture, how texture changes along cadence, how transport couples both. The second jet layer is the first place where the language makes it impossible to keep pretending the towers are separate. Because the mixed derivatives are not optional, they are part of the jet package. If you try to delete them, you are no longer speaking the full J2 phi. You are speaking a projection you have not justified. This is why Holophase feels so strict. It does not allow you to amputate structure silently. Now, inside this part, we must also say something subtle. We are still within finite jets. So when we talk about J2 phi, we are not declaring the universe is only second order. We are just choosing the layer that opens a new alphabet region. Second order is special because it is where shape appears. First order gives direction, second order gives bending of direction. And bending is the seed of almost every phenomenon people later call interaction. This is why, historically, forces were invented, because people experienced bending and sought a cause. Holophase does not deny the experience of bending. It denies the necessity of inventing a new primitive cause. At language level, bending is a constraint on J2 phi. Later, dynamics will tell us which constraints hold and how they propagate across domains. But here, we simply freeze the possibility. Any interaction-like sentence must be a second jet constraint. Now let's state the grammatical prediction and falsifier. The prediction. Many force laws can be rewritten as constraints on J2 phi. Not all, not yet, not without dynamics and further structure, but the language anticipates that what we later call laws will often be expressible as relations that involve second derivatives of the facelift or invariants built from them. This is a promise of compression. What looked like many separate forces may be one family of second jet constraints written in different coordinate accents. And the falsifier? Identify a local structural phenomenon that cannot be encoded as any invariant or constraint of J2 phi. Not as a limit, not as a hand-waving story, but as a publicly meaningful local statement that cannot be written as O of x equals f of J2 phi of x on any C2 domain respecting invariance. If such a phenomenon exists, then second jet language is insufficient, and we must climb higher in the jet tower to speak it. Notice what this falsifier does. It does not protect ego. It protects clarity. It tells us exactly when we must add more letters, and exactly when we are pretending. Now, we need one more deep point to keep the listener oriented. Even though we are not doing energy as dynamics here, we must keep the framing consistent. Energy is a tally, a report, not an ontic fluid. Second jet patterns are often what later become energy density, or stress, or tension in traditional physics. Holophase does not forbid such derived quantities. It simply keeps them in their rightful place, as tallies derived from jet structure, not as substances that push reality around. So if the listener feels the old intuition, but what makes it accelerate? We answer in language form. At this stage, we are not allowed to say what makes. We are allowed to say what patterns are permitted. An acceleration-like structure lives inside permitted second jet constraints. This is discipline. This is how we prevent later cosmology from becoming mythology. Now let me seal the emotional arc of this part with one final image. Imagine you're writing with a pen on paper. If your hand moves steadily in one direction, you draw a straight line. The first derivative tells you the direction of the stroke. But if your hand begins to curve, you draw an arc. The curve is not a new ink. It is not a new pen. It is your direction changing as you move. That is second derivative structure. Now imagine an entire universe drawn as a stroke in the holophase language. The first derivative gives the direction of change. The second derivative gives the bending of that change. The forces people argue about are, at this language level, nothing but the permitted bends of the stroke. And because triunity is always present, every bend is simultaneously a bend of cadence, a bend of texture, and a bend of transport. Different shadows of one bending stem. One stroke, one language, many shapes. That is the second jet layer. Now we end by sealing what you should carry forward. Here is the sentence. The second jet layer is where the language begins to speak shape. Not by importing forces, but by expressing how the first derivative stem A is allowed to vary, as invariants and constraints inside J2 phi. Always triunity coherent, always chart and lift invariant, and only on domains licensed to depth C2. And we turn our face to the next step, because once you admit second derivatives, a new question immediately appears. How do we separate genuine structural bending from bending that comes purely from a bad choice of chart, a distorted map, a misleading frame? Part 14 will deepen the translation discipline. It will show how second-jet claims remain clean under overlap grammar, and how we build invariants that do not depend on how we drew our coordinate grid. But for now, we stand on the mountain road in the fog, and we understand the new kind of scene. First derivative tells you where the road points. Second derivative tells you how the road is turning. And this is the first place where the universe begins to look like it has interactions, even though all we have done is listen more carefully to the language we already had. Always. Peace be upon.